The house was everything the family had hoped for. A quiet neighborhood, enough space for everyone, and a big backyard for their golden retriever. It had been a smooth move, almost too smooth. The family had spent the first few days unpacking and settling into routines, but amidst the chaos, something felt off. Their dog, usually calm and easygoing, had begun acting differently. It started almost immediately after they moved in. Instead of his usual cheerful energy, he seemed hesitant, particularly near the guest bedroom on the first floor. He would stop in the hallway and stare at the closet door, his ears twitching. At first, the family chalked it up to the dog adjusting to a new home. A few days in, the barking started. It was sharp and persistent, always aimed at the closet door. At first, the family thought it was a mouse or some other small animal trapped inside. They searched the closet thoroughly, even tapping on the walls to check for hollow spots. Nothing. The dog's barking continued every night. It wasn't just a passing nuisance. It was relentless. He would pace the hallway, bark in bursts, then sit in front of the door, staring at it as if waiting for something to happen. The barking wore on everyone's nerves. The father, exhausted from work, became the most vocal about it. He grumbled every time the barking started, muttering about how they'd need to call an exterminator or get the dog trained. The mother tried to be patient but admitted she was tired of the interruptions at night. The teenage daughter, already frustrated by the move, began wearing headphones to drown out the noise. As the weeks went on, the family started ignoring the barking altogether. There was only so much they could do. The father had checked the closet more times than he could count, even setting traps for rodents. But nothing was ever caught. They began closing the guest room door entirely, hoping it would deter the dog. It didn't. The barking, however, began to change. Over time, it became less frequent and less intense. The dog stopped pacing and rarely barked anymore, but his behavior remained strange. He would sit in the hallway outside the guest room, his body still, his gaze fixed on the closet door. His usual wagging tail and playful energy were gone. The family noticed the change, but didn't talk much about it. It was easier to dismiss now that the barking had subsided. They told themselves he'd adjusted to the house, that he was simply being a quirky dog. They went about their routines, ignoring the strange way he lingered near the closet, always watching but never moving. The daughter was the only one who found it unnerving. She hated walking past the guest room, especially when the dog was sitting there, motionless, staring at the closet. It wasn't fear. It was more a nagging discomfort, an unease she couldn't quite shake. But she didn't say anything. Everyone else had stopped paying attention, so she told herself she was being silly. The dog's behavior continued to fade into the background, an odd quirk the family learned to live with. They stopped checking the closet, stopped wondering what he was barking at, and moved on. Weeks turned into months, and the dog's strange behavior became an accepted part of the family's life. The barking had mostly stopped, leaving only his quiet, almost eerie fixation on the closet in the guest bedroom. He would sit there for hours, his gaze unwavering, as though waiting for something. The parents, tired of the disruption and frustrated by the lack of answers, decided to take a drastic step. If the dog was so focused on the closet, they reasoned, maybe removing it would solve the problem. The father spent a weekend dismantling the closet entirely. The door came off first, followed by the shelves and the frame. When he was finished, the area where the closet had been was just a blank wall. The family watched the dog's reaction closely. For the first day or two, he seemed disoriented, pacing the room and sniffing the empty space. But soon enough, he returned to his usual spot in the hallway, sitting in front of the blank wall where the closet had once been. It didn't make sense. Without the closet, what was he staring at? The parents tried to move past it. They painted over the wall and turned the guest room into a storage space, filling it with boxes and old furniture. Out of sight, out of mind, they told themselves. But the dog's behavior didn't change. Every evening, like clockwork, he would station himself in the hallway, his eyes locked on the same spot. The father laughed it off when telling friends. "We tore the whole thing out, and he's still sitting there like it's the most interesting spot in the house," he'd say. His friends joked that the dog was probably just eccentric. "Old houses and old dogs are a funny mix," one of them quipped. The mother, more practical, stopped paying attention entirely. She focused on organizing the rest of the house and planning future renovations, occasionally stepping over the dog as he sat in his usual place. But the daughter couldn't ignore it. She had started noticing smaller details about his behavior. How he never wagged his tail when he was in front of the wall. How his posture was different. Stiff, alert, almost tense. How he would sit perfectly still, sometimes for hours, his eyes never leaving that one spot. It unnerved her in a way she couldn't explain. One afternoon, while the parents were out running errands, she decided to spend some time with the dog. She sat on the floor next to him, leaning her back against the wall where the closet used to be. For a while, they stayed like that, the silence of the house wrapping around them. She couldn't help but glance at him every few minutes, hoping for some clue, some flicker of explanation. But the dog didn't move. His ears twitched occasionally, but his gaze remained steady, focused on a point just above the floor. That night, during dinner, the father mentioned hearing faint creaks in the floorboards near the guest room. He dismissed it as normal for a house of its age, but the mother suggested they call a contractor to take a look. "Just to be sure," she said. "We don't want any surprises." The contractor came a few days later. He was an older man with a weathered face and a toolbox that looked as though it had seen decades of use. He listened patiently as the family described the issue. They mentioned the dog's fixation, the odd creaking sounds, and their decision to remove the closet. "Pets can be funny like that," the contractor said with a chuckle as he got to work. He pulled back the carpet, examined the floorboards, and tapped on the walls with a small hammer. The dog watched him the entire time, sitting quietly in the hallway, his gaze never wavering. After about an hour, the contractor packed up his tools and straightened up. "Well," he said, brushing dust from his hands, "I don't see anything out of the ordinary. The structure looks sound, no signs of pests or water damage. Just an old house settling, if you ask me." The family felt a wave of relief. For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves to believe that the dog's behavior was just a harmless quirk. That night, they went to bed with the same sense of reassurance they'd felt after removing the closet. But as the house settled into its usual quiet, the daughter noticed something. The dog wasn't pacing or barking, but he was still in the hallway, sitting in his usual spot. His body was perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the same place on the wall. She stared at him from her bedroom doorway, the knot in her stomach tightening. The contractor hadn't found anything. There was nothing there. So why couldn't he look away? 2 years passed, and life in the house settled into a predictable rhythm. The dog's barking had long since stopped, replaced by his silent, watchful presence near the spot where the guest room closet once stood. The family had grown used to it, brushing off his behavior as an odd but harmless quirk. They rarely gave the guest room much thought anymore, treating it as a storage space for unused furniture and boxes. It wasn't until one quiet weekend, while the family was rearranging the guest room, that everything changed. The father had been moving an old chest of drawers when one of its legs caught on the wooden floor. As he dragged it across the room, the pressure cracked a plank beneath it, splitting the wood cleanly in two. The sound startled everyone in the house, including the dog, who ran into the room and immediately fixated on the broken section of the floor. "What now?" the father muttered, crouching to inspect the damage. He pried the loose plank away, revealing a hollow space beneath the floor. His brow furrowed as he reached for a flashlight and shone it into the opening. At first, he thought it was just dirt, but as the light hit something pale and angular, his stomach dropped. It wasn't dirt. It was bone. He stood up quickly, his face pale, and called for the others. The mother and daughter rushed into the room, their confusion turning to horror as they peered into the hole. What lay beneath the floor wasn't just a stray bone. It was a cluster of skeletal remains, pressed together in the narrow crawl space. Small, fragile bones. Bones that could only belong to children. The mother covered her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The daughter stepped back, shaking her head as if denying what she was seeing. The dog, sitting just behind them, let out a low whine, his eyes fixed on the hole. The police arrived within the hour, sealing off the house as they began their investigation. Over the next 2 days, forensic teams worked to carefully excavate the space beneath the guest room. The grim discovery unfolded piece by piece. 5 small bodies, each buried in the crawl space beneath the floor. The remains were in varying stages of decomposition, suggesting they had been there for years, possibly decades. The investigators found no identifying markers with the bodies, no clothes, no personal items. But the crawl space's location told its own story. The area had been deliberately concealed, with layers of flooring and plaster covering it completely. It was clear that whoever had buried the children there had gone to great lengths to ensure they were never found. The family learned that their home's previous owner, a reclusive older man, had died shortly before they purchased the house. Though nothing in his records hinted at a criminal past, neighbors recalled him as odd and distant, rarely seen outside and even less frequently visited. A background check revealed he had been questioned in the disappearance of a child decades earlier, but no evidence had ever linked him to the crime. The discovery made headlines, sparking outrage and sorrow across the community. The remains were eventually identified as 5 children who had gone missing from nearby neighborhoods in the late 1980s. Their families, long left without answers, were finally able to lay them to rest. For the family, the knowledge of what had been beneath their home all that time was too much to bear. They sold the house soon after the investigation ended, unable to shake the memory of what they had uncovered. Even in their new home, the daughter found herself haunted by the thought of the dog's behavior. The way he had stared at that spot for years, as if trying to warn them. The dog, too, was changed. Though he no longer barked at empty spaces, he would occasionally sit by closed doors or unoccupied rooms, his eyes distant and watchful, as though he could still sense something the family could not. The daughter often wondered what would have happened if they hadn't moved the chest of drawers that day. How much longer would the truth have remained hidden? And how many other secrets, buried and forgotten, still lingered beneath houses just like theirs?